Something happened this spring that the American media machine processed, packaged, and moved past before most people had time to actually absorb what they were looking at. You got the missile counts, you got the dramatic satellite footage, and the generals at podiums talking about precision and resolve and carefully calibrated responses. And then, almost before the smoke cleared, the cycle moved on. A new headline, a new crisis, a new thing to be outraged about. But I am not moving on, because what happened in the spring of 2026, what we are now calling the 2026 Iran War, is not a story you archive and forget. This is the story of the night America ran out of moves. This is the story of the 2026 Iran War, the conflict that was supposed to reassert American dominance and instead exposed, with a clarity that no press conference can undo, the precise location of American limits. The most powerful military in the history of civilization ran out of options. Not because it lacked firepower. It has more firepower than anyone. It ran out of options because firepower and strategy are not the same thing. And the entire world, every foreign ministry, every military planning cell, every rival and every ally who needed to know what American power actually looks like under real pressure watched it happen in real time and took very careful notes. If that frightens you, and if you believe that honest journalism still matters in this country, hit subscribe right now. Turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear is not the version that was handed to you in the official briefings. Take yourself back to February 28th of this year. That is the night Operation Epic Fury began. The United States, operating in coordination with Israel, launched what it described to the American public as a precision campaign targeting Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. That was the label, the stated justification. But anyone reading the underlying strategic documents, the intelligence assessments, the planning leaks that have since come out in contradictory fragments from multiple competing sources, anyone reading carefully understood what the real objective was. Regime change, not containment, not negotiation, not a carefully bounded military action with defined endpoints and a diplomatic off-ramp already built into the design. The goal was to end the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the instrument chosen to accomplish that goal, the move that the entire campaign was built around, the move that was supposed to make everything else cascade in Washington's favor, was the assassination of Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic, the man who had occupied that office for more than 30 years, the central organizing node of the entire Iranian state apparatus. He was killed in the opening hours of the campaign, and inside the planning rooms. In the immediate aftermath of that strike, I have no doubt it felt like the war was already half won. To understand why that feeling was catastrophically wrong, you have to understand the theory they were operating on. Because this theory did not come out of nowhere and it was not invented by reckless cowboys, it has deep roots in American strategic thinking going back to the early 2000s, and it went something like this. Authoritarian regimes are structurally fragile at the top. The entire system, the legitimacy, the coordination, the cohesion of the security apparatus runs through a single dominant figure. Remove that figure and the subordinates start fighting each other for position instead of fighting you. Remove that figure and a population that has been restless and angry and quietly seething for years finally sees an opening, and either rises up or stands aside while the outside power reshapes the political order. Cut the head off the snake and the body stops functioning. That was the theory, and on paper, with the right historical analogies selected, with the right models of comparative authoritarian fragility applied, it looked coherent. It looked like a plan. But here is what the planners chose to ignore, or what they knew and pushed past, because the political commitment had already been made and the operation was already in motion. Iran is not a pyramid. The Islamic Republic, for all its genuine dysfunction and all the legitimate grievances of the Iranian people against the clerical establishment, is a network. It has redundant command structures. It has distributed decision-making deliberately engineered into its architecture, specifically, intentionally, because Iran has spent decades studying exactly this type of decapitation scenario and building its institutions to absorb and survive one. The succession to Khamenei was settled in days, not weeks, not the months of political chaos and internal power struggle that every Western forecast had projected. Khamenei's son was named. The transition was executed with a cleanliness and speed that left Western analysts scrambling to throw out their collapse models. And the Iranian state kept functioning. The planners had bet everything on a theory. Iran had spent 20 years making sure that theory would fail. Now let's talk about what came next. Because this is where the story stops being about Iranian institutional resilience and starts being about the price that every person on this planet is now paying, including every American who never got a vote. On whether this war was worth the cost, the retaliation that followed Operation Epic Fury was not the calibrated, deniable, face-saving response that Washington had quietly modeled in its scenario planning. It was not the proxy harassment, the tanker incidents, the cyber operations, the things Iran could claim weren't its doing. This was Iran's full military doctrine, unfolded in public, in front of every satellite watching the theater. Hundreds of ballistic missiles, thousands of drones, coordinated, layered waves, specifically engineered to do one thing: saturate every defensive system in the region simultaneously, overwhelm the Israeli air defense architecture from multiple vectors at once, test the Patriot batteries covering American installations across the Gulf, drive debris and warheads into civilian areas in Arab states whose territory hosts American forces. A deliberate, cold-blooded message to every Gulf government that the cost of hosting the United States was no longer abstract. The targeting list was the message: you killed our supreme leader. We will strike everything that carries your flag. You hit our missile program. We will hit your bases. You threatened our economic survival. We will close the artery that runs through the center of the global energy system, the aircraft carrier, the iconic symbol of American power projection, the platform we send to a region when we want to signal dominance, becomes, in this particular geography, against this particular weapons inventory, a large, slow, expensive target sitting inside a kill box that Iran built across 2 decades specifically to receive it. Breaking the strait by force meant accepting a casualty count the American public has not psychologically processed since the Second World War. Every honest officer in that room understood this. Option 1 was dead. Option 2, negotiate. Find a diplomatic path out before the economic damage became permanently structural. Except, and this is where institutional culture becomes its own kind of trap, meaningful negotiation requires leverage. It requires the other side to believe that your alternatives are worse than making a deal. Iran had just demonstrated, in front of every surveillance satellite and intelligence apparatus watching the theater, that it absorbed a regime decapitation strike and kept functioning. It survived what planners had designed as a campaign-ending blow and was now holding the global energy economy by the throat. For Washington to enter negotiations at that moment was to enter them from a position of visible, documented, publicly humiliating weakness. And here is the problem: that nobody inside the Washington foreign policy establishment is willing to say plainly. American diplomatic culture, formed in the triumphalism of the 1990s and hardened through 20 years of post-9/11 dominance, does not know how to negotiate from weakness. It was never trained for that room. American negotiators walk to every table carrying the assumption that the other party needs the deal more than they do. When that assumption inverts, when you are the one whose economy is bleeding and whose strategic position is deteriorating faster than the cost of the deal itself, the entire tradition breaks down. Option 2 is available on paper and psychologically impossible in practice. Option 3. Escalate. Go bigger. Go wider. Expand the target list into something resembling the complete industrial dismantlement of the Iranian state. Bring the full conventional weight of American military capability to bear and impose costs so catastrophic that Iran's calculus changes. Except escalation against a country that just closed the most important shipping lane on Earth is escalation into a global recession. A real one. A sharp one, the kind that ends political careers in every capital simultaneously and ends American strategic credibility with every neutral government that Washington needs aligned in the larger competition with China. The countries watching, Japan, South Korea, India, every major economy in Southeast Asia, the entire global South, would have watched their economies seize to underwrite a war whose objectives they didn't share and whose costs they were never consulted about. That is not a coalition. That is a bill you hand to people who never agreed to pay it. 3 options, 3 dead ends. That is what I mean when I say Washington ran out of moves, and the leadership in Tehran knew it. Iran, having survived its worst day, had effectively seized the initiative in the conflict. That is the sentence that should arrest you, because it is the opposite of what every model of this war had predicted before the first missile flew. If this analysis is forcing you to reckon with something the official narrative was designed to prevent you from reckoning with, share this video right now. Post it. Send it to somebody who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what you think mainstream media got most catastrophically wrong about this spring. I read every single one of them. Now let's keep going, because what comes next is the part that changes everything. Here is a sentence I want you to sit with. The country that started this war was not the country that ended it. The conditional ceasefire that arrived on April 7th and 8th was not, as much of the Western coverage framed it, an Iranian capitulation or a managed American off-ramp. It was a pause, a negotiated pause, brokered by mediators who understood that both parties needed to stop the bleeding, while the actual settlement, the real settlement, the one that will define what power in the Middle East looks like for the next generation, got worked out on a longer timeline. And the mediator was not the United States. It was not Europe. It was not any of the institutional frameworks through which American global influence has historically been channeled into something that resembles international legitimacy. The mediator was Pakistan. Let that land. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state with deep historical and cultural ties to Iran, established working relationships with the Gulf monarchies, and a credibility in the Muslim world that Washington incinerated across decades of drone strikes, covert operations, and an approach to the region that treated its populations as variables in an American strategic equation rather than as people with their own agency and their own legitimate interests. To sit in that mediating chair, you need both parties to trust that you are not running a hidden agenda. You need credibility that is not borrowed from military pressure or economic coercion, but built through consistent, principled engagement over a long time. Pakistan had that currency in this specific context. Washington did not, and this is not primarily about who was technically disqualified from a procedural role. This runs deeper. Washington was not in that chair because Washington's credibility as an honest broker in the Middle East, as an actor whose word means something independent of the implied threat backing it, is gone. It was spent. Spent across interventions that left wreckage, sanctions regimes that punished populations, alliance arrangements that looked to the region more like extraction than partnership. The region has known this for years, but the 2026 Iran war made it impossible to deny to audiences that had been willing to extend a marginal benefit of the doubt. When the guns needed to stop, when both parties needed a neutral room to begin the larger conversation, nobody called Washington, they called Islamabad. That detail will outlive the specific terms of this ceasefire by decades. Graduate students will cite it as the identifiable moment when the architecture of legitimate mediation in the Middle East shifted away from Washington's framework entirely toward a model of regional order that no longer treats American approval as its organizing center of gravity. The country whose objectives drove the opening phase was not the country whose terms shaped the closing phase. That is, the geopolitical transition. It happened in approximately 6 weeks. The speed of it is what should disturb you most. Here is how power actually works in the international system. and I need you to follow this carefully because it explains the full weight of what was set in motion this spring. Every serious government on Earth maintains a strategic planning capacity whose entire function is to watch what other states do and update their models accordingly. These are not casual observers. These are analysts and strategists whose professional obligation is to read the world with clinical, unsentimental accuracy, no loyalty to the story believed last year, no diplomatic courtesy extended to comfortable assumptions, just the data, updated. And in the spring of 2026, every one of those planning cells was watching the same sequence of events. They watched the United States open a war with the maximalist objective of regime change in a country of 90 million people. They watched that objective fail. They watched Iran's retaliation hit American allies, American bases, and American economic interests across a region Washington has designated as its sphere of primary operational dominance. Since the 1970s, they watched the war conclude on terms brokered through a third party, while the principal instigator sat at a separate table. None of that is a minor data point. Every piece of it gets filed. Every piece of it updates the model. The Russian planning cell filed it. Russia is fighting its own grinding, protracted conflict against a coalition whose patience and material capacity are finite. The demonstration that a heavily pressured state can absorb a decapitation strike and keep fighting, that sustained external pressure does not automatically produce internal collapse, just recalibrated the Russian assessment of its own sustainability. The Chinese planning cell filed it. China has been watching American resolve with patient, methodical attention for years, building its own asymmetric denial capabilities with one specific geography in mind. The Taiwan calculus, how American commitments actually hold when the comfortable assumptions meet real military pressure in a constrained theater, just received the most significant real-world data point of this century, not necessarily toward imminent action, toward a more evidence-based, more confident reading of how American crises unfold under genuine pressure. The Gulf states filed it. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, these governments have been hedging for years, buying American weapons, while maintaining independent relationships across the region, refusing to place their survival entirely inside a single patron's commitment. Those hedge positions just received the most emphatic validation possible. The relationships they offer Washington in the next decade will be priced differently. The deference will be recalibrated. The Global South filed it. The implicit American premium, the price smaller and medium powers had been paying in policy deference and alignment costs for the implicit guarantee of American backing, just dropped. The bargaining range in every future negotiation with Washington has widened, not because American capability disappeared. It hasn't, but because the ceiling of what American power can actually accomplish without catastrophic collateral cost just got publicly and permanently marked down. Here is the thing that keeps me up at night when I work through all of this, and I want you to hear it not as geopolitical abstraction, but as a direct concern for what ordinary Americans are going to live through over the next decade based on the choices being made right now by people who will never personally absorb the consequences. The most dangerous moment in the life of a hegemonic power is not the height of its dominance. It is the specific, identifiable moment when that power first confronts the fact that its strength has genuine limits. Because that confrontation is politically and psychologically intolerable, the gap between what the power believes it should be able to accomplish in the world and what the world has just demonstrated it actually can do. That gap creates an overwhelming temptation not to accept the new reality, recalibrate, and operate more intelligently within real constraints. The temptation is to thrash, to find another theater, to manufacture a cheaper, more winnable demonstration of unchallenged authority somewhere else, to reset the deterrence equation before the old equation fully settles into the global consciousness as the new baseline. Look at the pattern. The British Empire after Suez in 1956 did not absorb the lesson with grace and self-knowledge. It thrashed for 20 years. Covert interventions, ghost operations, desperate attempts to reperform a power that a financial reality of the post-war world no longer supported, before finally landing in a foreign policy posture consistent with actual British capabilities and resources. The Soviet Union, after Afghanistan, did not look at a decade of grinding failure and honestly reckon with what it revealed about the fundamental limits of its model. It denied the lesson until the denial became one of the structural pressures that split the system from within. The United States had the opportunity to absorb the lesson of Iraq twice, and both times the political culture found ways to distribute the failure across enough institutions, enough time, and enough bureaucratic fog that the core strategic lesson never fully registered at the level where policy actually gets made. The 2026 Iran war is that moment again, except faster, more compressed, more publicly documented, more globally visible than any previous American strategic failure. The lesson cannot be buried in the pace of the news cycle the way earlier failures were absorbed and explained away. What happens in the next 3 to 5 years depends more than on any single leader, any single election, any single diplomatic initiative, on whether Washington's strategic culture can absorb this lesson without immediately reaching for the escape hatch of the next demonstration of dominance somewhere more manageable, whether the institutional wisdom exists across the think tanks and the defense establishment and the political class on both sides of the partisan divide. To say honestly, we overreached. The world told us we overreached. And the correct response is not to overreach in a different direction, but to bring our commitments into alignment with our actual capabilities and our actual national interests. That is not weakness. That is the only kind of sobriety that prevents the next overcorrection from being something far more catastrophic than the one we just lived through. The empire is not falling. American power is enormous, and it will remain the single most capable military actor on the planet for the foreseeable future. But the freedom of action that the United States possessed in the Middle East in the year 2000, or even in the year 2020, is not the freedom of action it possesses today. The empire is being put on a budget, and what a great power does when it discovers it is on a budget tells you everything about whether the decline is manageable or catastrophic. You can accept the new reality, adjust your posture, and operate with the strategic intelligence that your actual resources and your actual position in the world support. Or you can refuse to accept it, keep spending on the credit line, and leave every ordinary American holding the bill at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in the rising cost of a global order that no longer bends automatically to Washington's preferences, because Washington's preferences are no longer automatically enforceable. The men and women who never voted on Operation Epic Fury, who never sat in a situation room, who never drew a salary from a defense contractor or a think tank or a foreign policy shop, those Americans deserve a political class honest enough to choose the first path. They almost certainly will not get one without a sustained, informed, unrelenting demand that the people in power account for what actually happened this spring. Not the comfortable version. Not the version where a decisive strike produced a manageable outcome and the world went back to normal by May. The world did not go back to normal. The world rearranged itself in the weeks of that war, quietly and permanently, in ways that are still unfolding right now, in every capital that updated its model of what American power actually means in practice. The pen moved this spring. Where it eventually lands is still being written, but it will be written in part by whether Americans like you stay informed, stay engaged, and refuse to let the most important strategic story of this decade get buried under the next news cycle. If this video gave you something real to think about, and I believe it did, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next, because this story is not over. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, do you think Washington has the institutional capacity to absorb this lesson, or will the temptation to manufacture the next demonstration of dominance win? That question, that argument about what America does when it discovers its limits, is the most consequential political conversation happening in this country right now. And I want to have it with you.